Hello everyone, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. Today we are going to be wrapping up our monk build guide finally. We're going to be covering more or less why you would want to play a monk over a fighter. And we'll cover a few, well, essentially the pros and cons between the two. Also, we're going to be talking about another particular mechanic for Pathfinder and also for the Dungeons and Dragons games, namely the different kinds of armor class that you may have. Generally, your armor class is going to be, your a base level of 10 that everybody gets. Hell, the area and environment just gets a basic armor class of 10. So if you want to hit a specific spot, say with a bit of artillery or an arrow or a spell like Fireball, you just have to roll and nail a 10 or better. Everybody gets that. Also, you get your dexterity modifier applied to it, plus whatever armor you may be wearing if you're using a shield, or if you have any magic bonuses coming into play. Or for smaller or larger creatures, you may get another bonus or a penalty. Obviously, larger creatures taking the penalty, smaller and smaller and smaller creatures getting the bonus. But you also get touch armor class and flat-footed armor class. What do those mean? Well, touch armor class is calculated with 10 plus your dexterity modifier. This one, it doesn't matter what armor you have. If you have some other bonuses like, say, a ring of protection or the mage armor spell, or in the case of our monk, you have your wisdom modifier as a bonus to your armor class, well, that's what it takes for a target to just reach out and touch you. Hence why armor doesn't matter, because they just need to reach out and touch you. It doesn't have to hit any weak points in armor, the gaps or the joint parts like at the shoulder or in the neck or around the thighs, elbows, etc., etc. And that would come up in the case of a lot of spell attacks, mostly things like Shocking Grasp or Ray of Enfeeblement, which that one's more of a range touch attack, but still, it doesn't take your armor doesn't matter in that case. It just has to reach out and connect with you. It doesn't have to hit any particular point to actually start dealing damage. And the other thing is with the flat-footed armor class, that is 10 plus whatever bonus you get from your armor. So whatever armor you're wearing. Typically, shields don't count into that, but magical bonuses like rings of protection and again, mage armor, those kinds of effects will factor into that as well. And this is used when the character is unaware. They're not ready for a fight. They're not expecting a fight. So somebody who's relaxed and not on the balls of their feet, not set and ready to go, ready to rumble with whatever's coming their way. And that's where this is going to get factored in. And I bring this up here because again, it just seems to be the appropriate time to bring it up because we're about to compare these things and cover them as a pro or a con. And monks, like I'd mentioned before, tend to get some pretty solid bonuses to their touch armor class and their well, not so much the flat-footed armor class, but touch armor class is really useful because things like Ray of Enfeeblement or Shocking Grasp or any number of spells and effects can be really incredibly devastating, especially for a melee damage dealer oriented character. Whereas because fighters have such a crap touch armor class, they are really vulnerable to these kinds of spells. They're vulnerable to magic in general, and so this is a spot where the monk really shines defensively without really having to do anything active. They just have to, well, level up and develop in their class more. Whereas a fighter will probably be depending on other players, their characters for support, so other mages, wizards, clerics, witches, bards, whoever it is that can either protect them from these various spells or remove the effects of these various enfeeblements and these debuffs that they may be getting slapped with. So, moving on from there, we come up to the Monk versus Fighters pros. Now, I've talked a little bit already, going off on about the different types of armor class that you're dealing with, but monks get great save scores. I mentioned this already before, but it bears repeating. Their fortitude, reflex, and will saves all develop nicely. There's no save score that develops slowly. They're the only class that has this kind of a progression for all three of these particular stats, and it's a huge help. To top it off, they generally will get immunity to certain things that will affect these various scores that you typically have to roll on. Like with fortitude, they become immune to diseases and poisons. So it negates having to roll off of fortitude saves. And reflexes, they just have a really easy time with this. And if you take the improved reflexes feat, it just magnifies this even further. So really, really fantastic stuff here. And monks are going to be saving more often than not. Oh, also, they get the uncanny dodge and the like. So whenever they get hit with something, they can negate quite a bit more damage. So really awesome. Also, they're very competitive when it comes to their damage potential. We already covered this in the previous video, where we see that even without factoring in some different magical bonuses that they may have, or throwing in the 2 extra attacks you would get from Medusa's Wrath, or even using one of your chi points to give yourself another free attack at your highest attack bonus, the monks stay pretty well competitive with the fighter and can possibly fairly easily outclass the fighter in terms of damage potential. But I leave it as competitive because it is, well, we'll cover that in a moment. I already talked about how they have great touch armor class and how this defends against spell attacks like Grave Enfeeblement and the like. They have incredible mobility options. They get higher movement that only gets better as time goes on, and they get an ability that will let them dimension door around. Top this off with the fact that they're not wearing armor, which not only will slow characters' movement speed, or their base movement speed down, but also apply check penalties to various skills like climbing or acrobatics or swimming and the like. Monks will have a great ability to move around and get into places where they need to be, regardless of whether they just have to run or they're rolling skill checks like climbing or swimming. They're going to be able to get to where they need to go. I already mentioned here that monks get an outright immunity to diseases and poisons and the like. It comes a little bit later on, but you know what? You take the benefits where you can get them, and these are some pretty solid things to have protections against, especially since officially handed down from on high from the creators over at that made Pathfinder, that this immunity to diseases does apply to curse-based diseases like lycanthropy and mummy rot. So again, really, really great to have. And I'd already mentioned before that they get their class ability bonus to their armor class, as well as the wisdom modifier bonus to their AC and their touch AC and the like. It's really great to have. But it's not all sunshine and daisies for the monk. They've got plenty of problems that need to be considered as well. For example, especially in comparison to the fighter, well, no class gets the same number of feats that the fighter does, but monks do not have a wide array of feats that they can select from, and feats really can help to open up a lot of tactical abilities, especially for your melee combat oriented characters. Monks just will not get that flexibility and level of customization that fighters can get. And they also have a poor number of ranged attack options. They're basically stuck with shuriken, and if your DM allows them, which I can't really think of many reasons why they wouldn't, only a small selection of weapons with reach, so there's not going to be a whole lot of range available to the monk. They're going to be stuck mostly in melee, and whatever range options they do have are going to be incredibly short range. To top it off, they also have a limited melee option selection, and your class is going to be really highly dependent on flurry of blows. And this is why I leave the monk's damage potential at competitive, because until their natural attacks develop up to a point where they're dealing 1d10 or 2d6 points of damage with their bare fists, they're going to be not as effective at keeping up with the damage output that the fighter can put out there. And certainly if they stay armed, it'll help. And also if they get some different enchantments on their various weapons, that'll help overcome damage reduction. But they're still dependent on being able to make use of flurry of blows. And if you're in a situation where you cannot use flurry of blows, your damage potential suffers massively. It's barely even, you're not even really contributing at that point. You're just the most you're doing is you're making yourself a target and maybe absorbing a few attacks that might have otherwise gone to some of the other squishier characters like the wizards or the like. So really, you really want to be using flurry of blows as often as possible. There's no two ways around it. Also, starting off, you're going to have a lower armor class, and it's going to be okay at higher levels, but attacks are going to have an easier time landing on you. Hence why you want to make careful and regular use of flurry of blows. That way you're dealing as much damage as possible and taking targets out faster. This is how you're going to survive. Maybe if your cleric friend is able to slap you with a couple of healing spells to keep you in the fight, that'll help, but mechanically, and this whole series is about looking at the more mechanically effective options over the story options, but from a mechanical standpoint, healing's not the most effective thing to do during a fight. Because as long as you have 1 or 10, even down to 1 hit point, you're still going to be operating at the same level of effectiveness as if you had all 80 of your hit points, all 90 of your hit points. So really, there's not a lot of reason to heal unless it's very desperate and you're down to the last handful of hit points and the next hit will put you down. Then maybe the cleric might want to consider healing you, but properly built cleric can be an absolute wrecking ball in their own right. So, it just really depends. But that's assuming you're looking at things from a purely mechanical perspective. Ideally, players, you should all be role-playing and doing what you think your characters would do, not just what is the most mechanically effective option. So there's that to consider. Also, you can't wear armor at all, which does have some benefits that I mentioned before. You're not getting an armor check penalty, your movement's not being slowed down, but not being able to have that boost to your armor class is a bit of a pain to deal with. Especially when it's coupled with the fact that you are going to have lower hit point totals for a frontline melee character, especially without that armor. That's a hard hit to have to deal with. It's a 1-2 punch right there that just absolutely sucks, but you can still work with it, and it helps that you have better resistances to various spells and effects and a better ability to deal with those effects, because that's what's going to cause a lot of trouble for the fighter, because fighter has a great armor class, especially if they're using a shield. Fighter can do a lot of damage and keep up with you and your damage potential, possibly even outclass you. Definitely outclasses you if you can't flurry. So, like I said, it's a mix of pros and cons, and there are more pros than cons, but not every point is weighted equally. Just because there are more pros and cons does not necessarily mean that the monk is the better option in comparison to a fighter. And also, depending on the campaign you're playing or your DM, they may not even allow the monk, just because thematically, aesthetically, they don't quite fit with the high Western fantasy medieval sort of setting. So doesn't quite work out. Like I said, doesn't quite fit thematically, so it may not even be allowed in the first place. But that aside, monks and fighters, I'd say, are actually fairly even with one another. Possibly, if I were to give you my opinion on it, I actually think fighters do come out ahead a bit, just because they have a greater degree of flexibility and a greater degree of options for how they approach combat on the battlefield. Whereas monks, they get a ton of abilities, but all the abilities are focused on getting into place and dealing damage. It's a lot of extra fluff to achieve the same result, and not always the most effectively, especially, again, like I said, if you can't use a flurry of blows. It all depends on how you play it. But like I said, this is just a look at the more mechanically effective options. That's all this guide has been about. That's all the previous guides have been about. Me personally, I definitely prefer it a lot more when my players focus more on story and role play, and just actively contribute to making the gameplay much more fun, creating laughs and great memories. So take this with a grain of salt and just use it as something useful to maybe help give you some ideas, and also to make the monk character just a little bit more effective at the table. You don't have to follow this guide in its entirety. I don't expect anybody to, but there it is. And now we're going to go ahead and call it for there. Next guide that I'm going to be doing, a viewer and actually a friend of mine, a member of the gaming group I'm currently running around with, as we can, has requested that I do a build guide on the witch character class. And I've been taking a look at it and studying up on it, and it certainly seems like a whole lot of fun. And where this monk guide has actually been fairly long, the Witch's guide may be just a tad longer because it's a full spellcasting class, and I've got to take a look at all the spells and try to measure out which ones are more effective than others and what the best options are. Like with this guide and the other guide, I'm going to be leaving out the different class archetypes just because that's so much to have to dig through and weigh on. Some, and like with anything else, some archetypes are definitely much better than others mechanically, but try to take a look at the different archetypes for their story options as well. As even though the Pathfinder mechanics are a bit more focused around creating great combat, don't let that cause you to lose sight of the incredible moments of roleplay that you can create alongside with your DM and storyteller. But with that said, I've been your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. You folks have yourselves a good night.